Thanks for joining us for the Keeping It Young podcast, conversations about marriage, family, and ministry life. I'm Dave.
And I'm Bethany.
We're the Youngs. We are glad you have joined us today. Today's going to be a beginning of maybe a new series. I don't know, they could stand alone, I suppose, but they go together.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about educating our children and the choices we make and how we make them and why we make them. And at least 2 sessions here we're going to do on this topic. And today is part 1. Making wise choices about the education of your children. Mm-hmm. So Bethany and I are ready to get started here. And just to get us going, sweetheart, let's think through a little bit about what we're looking for when we mean educating our children.
As many of you would know, there are choices out there when you're talking about educating your children. There is the public school choice. There are Christian school choices. And of course, now there's homeschooling. And a lot of us are familiar with the homeschool with the new COVID restrictions that we had the last few months of spring.
No one would have thought that the entire United States would have become homeschoolers overnight. That was
literally
a little freaky.
Within a few days.
Let's just take a moment here as we start thinking about the educating of our children. We certainly want our kids to be educated.
Yes.
I think every parent we've ever met is concerned that their children do well when it comes to education. And the things we want to talk to you about basically just have to do with how we can approach it wisely and biblically and in the best way possible. So let's just start with some perspective. And this would be perspective for me and Bethany, or from me and Bethany. And just our perspective on the 3 options there and the pros and the cons of each one.
Right.
And so let's just start with public school. That's how I was educated. My entire life I attended public schools, as did my brother and my sister. And I know many of you listening probably would have done the same thing. And as with any of the other 2 choices, there certainly are pros and cons. So let's talk about some of the pros in the public school. I'm thinking they are cheaper, which is a big one.
Right.
A very big one. They're convenient. You send your kids out the door, they get on a bus, they go to school. And you don't have to think too much about their lunch and even other things during the day because it's just kind of all taken care of. There's not a lot of pressure to the parents necessarily. The education takes care of itself.
Pretty much.
And there's some, would look at it for probably other reasons, but those are kind of the pros that we would think of. And then there certainly would be cons in a public school.
Yes.
There could be the allowing our children to be educated by less than biblical perspectives. That's a nice way of saying it, perhaps.
Right.
Not every teacher in the public school would have a unbiblical perspective, but certainly
some would.
Some would, and maybe some would even say many would. There are teachers in the public school system who are not godly, and that was certainly true when I was even in school. And some would even say there's greater peer pressure for our children regarding ungodliness.
Yes.
And certainly there's some things you would expect your kids to face in a public school that you would assume they might not face in a Christian school or in a homeschool environment.
Right.
Peer pressure towards drugs or alcohol, or some would even assume that in a Christian school or homeschool there'd be less peer pressure towards things like pornography and all of those kind of things.
Immorality, yes.
So the public school would have pros and cons. My wife now, Bethany here, she attended a Christian school.
Totally Christian
so
educated.
So what do you think, sweetheart, would be the pros and cons of the Christian school movement?
Well, certainly in the Christian school, you would hope that they would have a spiritual influence from their teacher and from their curriculum. They would get a biblical worldview. And you would hope also that there would be a positive spiritual peer pressure within the Christian school.
Sure.
But then some of the cons would be the expense.
Yes,
Christian education is very expensive. There is a lot more on the schedule. And you may think, well, why would that be different than a public school? Well, in a Christian school, you have a smaller number of children or students doing a large amount of things, whether that be sports or music or some kind of drama. Whereas in the public school, you have all of these students who get involved, and so they cannot possibly do everything. In a Christian school, it seems that so many of the students do so many things.
In a lot of our meetings, the kids in the public school would have 1 or 2 extracurricular activities.
Right.
And in the Christian school, it's not uncommon for a kid to play every sport.
Yes.
And be involved in every activity.
So the schedule
can
be mind-boggling.
Yes, it can.
Unfortunately, there is a potential for ungodly peer pressure in a Christian school. I can say this without malice because I was Christian educated, and I do know that teenagers even if they're saved teenagers, are sinners. And
Sure.
so there is some ungodly peer pressure. There is a potential for peer grouping. What do we mean by that, David?
By more peer grouping than maybe even in a public school environment. It seems like in our educational system today that our kids are influenced, that peers, your peers, that would be where it is. The way they dress, the music they listen to. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we have observed that seems to be increasing in many places in our Christian school movement in our churches, they do tend to be very peer-oriented. Our kids sit together at school.
Right.
They sit together in the youth group. Mm-hmm. Many times our children will walk into because we travel, so we see a huge plethora of different youth groups and churches.
We experience
and sometimes our kids will walk in and you can pick out the groups. The seniors sit with the seniors. The basketball players in the Christian school sit with the basketball players in the Christian school.
True, okay.
And so there tends to be more of a potential for peer grouping.
So not an intermingling between the high school, junior high, elementary. Gotcha. And then also in the Christian school, there is sometimes that assumption of godliness because there is an outward submission to the rules, to the authority, but there is not that heart submission to God.
And that's a tricky one, I think, in the Christian school realm, because we get the idea that here's a kid in our church, and he's a natural-born leader, or she's a natural-born leader.
Right. And
she's straight A student, and she does really well on the court. And you can get the idea that, of course, this is a good kid. This is a good kid.
Right.
And yet, inwardly, we may lose that kid because it's easy to assume that because this is a straight A student, because this kid has great personality, because this kid is excellent on the ball court or the field, we can get the idea that this is a godly kid, but it can all be outward instead of a heart matter.
Right, and we do need to remember, I think, referring to some of our earlier podcasts, a good child is not necessarily a godly child.
That's very true. And we will be talking about that even more in the days to come as we're going to start a series soon on training our children from the youngest right on up to, through their teen years. So there is the public school, pros and cons. There's the Christian school, which has pros and cons. I was public school taught. Bethany was Christian school taught and actually taught in a Christian school herself.
Yes, I did.
And the first couple of years we were in revival work, we were very involved in Christian education. And one of the ways I made ends meet in the weeks when we had no meeting scheduled is I actually taught some in a Christian school as well.
Right.
So that one is one we're very familiar with, and we get a lot of interaction in that. And I preach in a lot of Christian schools as well. And then there's the homeschool movement. I was public school, Bethany was Christian school, and our own children have all been homeschooled. And there are pros and cons in this one as well. And we want to be very fair about this because we certainly would feel quite strongly about the homeschool because we've done it and loved it.
Right, but we are not anti-public school or Christian school either.
That is correct. That is correct, and we'll say more about that in a moment. Here's some of the pros. There can be a very strong, positive family influence in the homeschool movement. Just like the Christian school, there is a biblical worldview that is taught most often in the homeschool movement. And in a sense, there can be more parental biblical discipleship.
Yes.
And that's the one thing that we have fallen in love with in our homeschool movement with our children is we did get to influence their education, their worldview, but we also were able to, in a more direct way, disciple their heart towards spiritual things. That doesn't always happen, obviously.
Right.
And every one of us would know stories where it didn't happen. But that to us is a strong pro for the homeschool movement. And then there's also the parental opportunity for streamlined teaching.
Right.
Proverbs 22:6 says that we're to train up a child individually in the way he individually should go. And we've noticed that with each of our children, they're different. And the way Abby learned was different than the way Josh learned.
Totally.
The way Charity thinks was different than the way Abigail thought. And we've been able to have a hand in streamlining their education. They all took the same classes, covered
Basically.
the same courses.
Oh, yes, academics.
In a sense, made the same grades.
Across the board,
pretty much. But that parental opportunity for streamlined teaching was huge for us. Because Bethany, especially more than me, she's the one that had her finger on the pulse of, what's this child struggling with? How is this child learning slightly different than the other one?
Right.
And as we were able to streamline those teaching methods. So those are some of the pros. Do you think of any others there in the homeschool movement?
Well, you're just together, and it does strengthen the family unit.
Yes, it certainly does. And then there's some cons. There's money involved.
Absolutely.
So it's probably not usually as expensive as a Christian school.
No.
But homeschooling does cost money, usually more money than most people think.
True.
So a lot of people think, homeschooling will be easy, but it is very expensive if you're going to do everything by curriculum and keep up with it all.
Right.
Curriculum is very expensive, no matter how you look at it. One of the cons of homeschooling is it is a major investment of time.
Major.
It takes hours of recording, lesson plans, planning, preparation, ordering curriculum.
The actual teaching time.
A lot of the things that are done for you, like in a Christian school or public school, you have to do yourself in homeschooling. And then there is the potential for a loss of peer opportunities. In the same way that in the Christian school, they can become very peer-oriented and even peer-controlled. In the homeschool movement, some homeschool families do miss the chance for their children to enjoy peer opportunities. And we were very aware of that. And the two things I think that we did that helped big time with that, one was, there was really three. The first one was that we insisted our children be friends with each other.
Right.
So our children never thought of, I have no friends, because Josh had Matt and Jake, and Matt had Josh and Jake had Matt and Josh, and Abby had Josh and Matt, and each of our kids were friends. And that really shows up when our kids get together, because it's loud and there's inside jokes and there's inside stories. And so that was the first way. There was that family friendship. And the second one was our local church.
Yes.
Because as a homeschool family, we were very involved in our local church. Sunday school programs, teen connection classes, opportunities to be around the other teens at church, to serve in the youth group, to be very active in the youth group. And so there was that. Plus, in our revival campaigns, our children had the opportunity to be around people every night of their lives.
Every night.
And they learned to talk to adults, old, middle-aged, young adults.
Children.
In fact, more than a few of our children, when you would say to them, who are your closest friends, may mention someone 10 years older than them.
True.
And it was because we have employees that were, mentoring towards the ministry, and our children became very close with these people who travel with us, minister with us, serve with us.
Right.
And we set up those opportunities. So there are three options: public school, Christian school, homeschool.
Right.
And it is our opinion that each parent should approach it wisely.
Right.
For instance, we homeschool, but it's not just one of those things that, this will work for us. Beth and I believe that it's important to pray about it.
Yes.
To really seek God.
Many people would think that we homeschool because, quote, we have to, because we travel and want to be together as a family, which is part of it. It is practical.
Yes.
And we do want to be together as a family, but we also have prayed about it, and we love the outcome of the homeschool family.
Yeah, we're quite sold on it at this point of our lives. However, on each of those, and I'll just say this before we give you some things to consider, in each one of those, we've seen success and failure. Yes. We do know public school families where the children genuinely love God, are very well educated, and are amazing Christians.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, we know some glaring failures.
Yes.
But that's also true in the Christian school movement. We know some really godly kids who attended Christian school all their life, and they're serving the Lord, and they have amazing families now that they're adults. We know some glaring failures.
Yes.
And the same thing would have to be said for homeschooling.
Absolutely.
And so moms and dads, what it tells you is that whichever option you believe God is leading you towards, it's important that we do the homework, that we seek God, that we do everything we can to help our children.
Right.
So let's take the time that we have left here, sweetheart, and let's talk about some things to consider. And I think we have 4 or so here, and really 5, I guess, 5. And so let's just jump right in. And here's the first one. We need to recognize that cultural norms may not be God's will for our children.
Right.
Tell us what we mean by that. Tell our audience what we mean by that.
What we mean is there are cultural norms, whether that be in society, in your neighborhood, or there are cultural norms even in a church.
That is true.
So you may attend a church that is strongly what we would say a homeschool church.
Yes.
Probably you can hear in the background, that's our Peyton getting a drink. We're in our kitchen. Anyway, so if you hear
That's
that,
our dog,
sorry.
by the way.
Yeah,
Yes.
our dog, Peyton. Oh, yeah, I probably should have said that too. Peyton is not a child getting a drink like that. Okay, dog. Anyway, here we go.
She was distracted there. That's
the
part of
cultural
homeschooling.
norms would be what is expected either from your neighbors in your neighborhood. Well, we always put our kids on the bus and they just go to public school, or in your church. I just said some churches are homeschool churches.
And some are
churches
very strong Christian school
are
churches.
strong Christian school churches. But no matter what the cultural norm is, whether it's your church or society, you as a parent, you are the one that is supposed to be in charge of that child. You are the one who is discipling that child. You
Yes.
are the one who is in charge of their education.
That's
so you as
so
parents
important.
need to pray about what God would have you do with your child.
Yeah, and just as an aside, it's interesting to me that in some churches, and this is if you're a youth pastor or a pastor, I would just say to you to be very aware. Take a good survey of your church. Is your church kind of known as we're a Christian school church? And is it true that most of your youth group is made up of Christian school kids, or most of your youth group is made up of homeschool kids? Sometimes in a church that results in there being a real negativity towards other teenagers.
Right.
And I would say, and this has been a strong opinion of mine for a long time based on all the churches we've been in, that the best church youth groups we're aware of is a combination
Yes.
of all of them.
All three.
It says that I'm aware of our public school kids and trying to reach them. It says I'm aware of our Christian school kids and trying to disciple them.
Yes.
I'm aware of our public school, or our homeschool rather, and trying to reach them as well.
Absolutely.
And so we've got to recognize that cultural norms may not be God's will for your children. You are the parent. You have to decide.
Right.
And so the first one there. The second one, we would say to you, here's just something to consider as you make a choice about educating your children. Approach this issue prayerfully. Now, this is just so simple. Pray about it.
Yes.
Ask God, what do we need to do? And I know there's going to be people who will say, well, if you pray about it, it's God's will for you to homeschool your children. And some will say, no. If you pray about it, God's going to tell you to put your kids in a Christian school.
Right.
And I've even met a few people along the way who feel just as strongly that shame on us for taking our teenagers out of a public school. Now there's all darkness and there's no light
Right.
in the
There's
public school.
No influence.
But the fact of the matter is, God knows your children. God has a plan for your life. Pray about it. Be in unity as a couple.
Yes.
And so seek God together. It's time, that we as a couple pray about it. Talk to God about it.
Yes.
And seek His will about it. Be on the same page as a husband and a wife. That's going to be very
Absolutely.
important, because whatever choice you make is going to have pros and cons. And the way to deal with the cons is you're on the same page spiritually.
Right.
Right? And then continually evaluate. Bethany brought that up in the sense that our children are always changing.
Yes.
And what may have been a particular way to educate our children in one town, maybe a job location, means it's time to evaluate.
Right.
Or a change in our child's heart. Maybe a negative influence would say, you know what, we need to make a change here and do something differently.
Right.
So approach the issue prayerfully. Any other thoughts there regarding that particular topic, sweetheart?
I would just, I have had ladies come to me and say, it's such a burden of mine to homeschool our children, and my husband doesn't want to do that. Well, then you just keep praying and you follow your husband.
That's really good
What
advice.
you have to do. And then as far as it may change, I know a pastor and his wife who homeschooled their family while they were in one church, and then the Lord led them to another church that had a Christian school, and they put their girls in the Christian school. Of course, they're still very heavily involved in their girls' education.
Yeah.
So it may change.
Yeah.
And it's just a practical or even a spiritual step that you
Sure.
need to take with your child.
So we recognize that cultural norms may not be God's will. We approach the issue prayerfully. The third thing we would say is approach the issue practically. Our first responsibility is the spiritual well-being of our children, not the academic well-being of our children.
Right.
That's a huge statement. It's easy to send my kids to a public school and take no thought for their spiritual well-being. It's easy to assume because they're in a Christian school, oh, they're fine.
Yeah.
And yet in a Christian school, I'm responsible for the spiritual well-being of my kids.
I think it would be even more assumptive on the homeschooler's
Yes,
part. Well,
absolutely.
they're in my house. I
They're
influence them
fine.
all day
Yeah.
long. No, you are responsible for their spiritual discipleship.
So as you think through this this matter of approaching it practically, talk to us about the time factor, sweetheart, because there's a big time factor in educating our children.
There is. It's a huge commitment, usually on the mom's part. And sometimes you can be considering and thinking, oh, that'll be so easy. It'll be so fun. We'll all be together. We'll be around the table. And then the time actually comes crashing down on you.
Sure.
That you have to homeschool. You may not have time to homeschool your children. And you need to take that into consideration.
Yeah, and you even need to take that into consideration if you decide to use Christian education, because there's the time in getting to the school that's going to be different. Mm-hmm. The events afterwards can be late nights of picking up a son or daughter at a parking lot who's been away at an away game or at an event. So there's a time factor. So we just approach it practically. What is the time investment going to cost me?
There might be a Christian school that you really love, but it's an hour away.
Sure.
Why would you do that?
That's 2 hours a day.
Yes.
Your kids will be in a car. And that's probably worth your considering. Finances are a factor as you approach this issue practically. It costs a lot of money to educate your children. And Christian education is expensive. Homeschool education is expensive.
Right.
And in a sense, public school education can be, though it is the cheaper option.
Right.
But it's something for you to just approach it practically. And as you think about educating your children are a factor.
Yes.
Their abilities,
yes,
their talents. And Bethany especially is the one who does more of that in our family. She's aware of what each child is kind of leaning towards.
Right.
And as we work together on that, she makes me aware of it. And we just think through, okay, if this is what our son is thinking, what's the best course?
What can we do?
And we got to cover the bases.
Yes.
We want all the bases covered. We're the state of Florida for us.
Oh, absolutely.
And we're very aware of that. So we're very practical. We're very prayerful. The fourth one is that we approach the issue spiritually. Talk to our audience about exactly what we mean by that, sweetheart.
Well, if you as a couple pray about it and you decide, you know what, we are going to send our children to school. First of all, you need to be very aware of them as your parent. You are the parent. And we cannot emphasize this enough. Even if your children go to the best Christian school that is available in your area, you are the parent. You are the one who should be influencing them spiritually. But if you decide to send them to school, then you should be very aware of who is influencing them at the school. Yes. Who will their teachers be? Who will their peers be? Whether it's public school or Christian school, you need to be very aware of who is spiritually influencing your children.
In a open enrollment Christian school even.
Oh, absolutely.
Where do their friends go to church? What do they believe that is different than what we believe?
Right, and that doesn't mean that it's wrong. It is not wrong. I went to Christian school with kids from all kinds of different churches, absolutely. And it actually was a strengthener for me. Why do I believe what I believe? But you should be aware, and don't be fall into that duping of thinking, well, they go to a Christian school. Obviously, that Christian school would never hire a teacher that would influence my child in a way that I wouldn't. No, don't think that.
Yeah, it's important to know. It's important to approach it spiritually, to get to know the teachers, to know the curriculum, to talk to your children.
Yes, be aware.
And hear what they're learning and why they're learning it. Homeschooling, for you that are considering homeschooling or doing it, remember that homeschooling is not just about, I have to keep my kids with me.
Right, it's not, I can't give my baby up.
I can't let somebody else. We believe as parents that we should be training our kids to do right even when we're not with them. And so we didn't homeschool them just so that they would have no other influence. We wanted to homeschool them so we could disciple them. We thought it was our best option.
Yes.
We believed it was God's will for us. But we were entirely fine with giving our children ample opportunity to be without us.
Right.
To teach them how to take a stand when we're not there.
Right.
And how to do right. And Christian schooling is not just about, well, we're not putting our kids in a public school. There should be, God's will's involved in this. Does God want your kids in a Christian school? And what are you doing to help your children in the Christian school to become godly? Not just a good kid because they're really good on a basketball court or a volleyball court or a soccer field or a baseball field.
Right.
But do they really love the Lord?
Absolutely.
Are they growing and maturing in areas that will matter when high school is over?
Right.
Can they talk to adults? Do they show a heart for worship when they go to church? And is chapel just something they have to do and they begin to hate God's word in the time of hearing preaching?
Right.
Or do they really have a heart to learn God's word and to grow? We have to approach the issue spiritually. And we're going to run out of time in just a moment here, and so I hope you'll join us next week to hear a little bit more practical advice. But one of the biggest things that Beth and I would say to you who are moms and dads, give grace generously.
Yes.
It is so easy, and we've experienced it, and maybe we're sensitive because we've experienced it. We have been in churches to where they find that our kids are homeschool kids, and there's an immediate bristling. We've actually been guests. My wife has been guest in Sunday school where a Sunday school teacher ripped her personally on homeschooling, even though she knew that here's a homeschool family. And it's the strangest thing how people can feel so strongly that we fail to give grace to each other.
Right.
And it's important. If you're a homeschooler, give grace to those parents who are using the Christian school.
Right.
Give grace to
their
those.
Decision as a parent.
If a parent's using the public school, give them grace.
Absolutely.
The verse I'm thinking of is the love chapter, charity chapter in 1 Corinthians, where the Bible says that when we are filled with the love of Jesus Christ, we think no evil. So if you are feeling God is leading me to homeschool my children, then I am, according to God's word, to think no evil of you. I'm to assume here's a parent that's really trying to raise their kids for God.
Absolutely.
And if you're wanting to homeschool, or a Christian school rather, or if you choose to use the public, I have a really good pastor friend who I was a little stunned after being around his family. They were a very godly family, very sharp family. Their kids were polite. Their son was super involved, was a very positive influence even on our son. And so one day we just said, where do your kids go to school? And he was a little uneasy. I could tell he was a little, but then they go to a local public school. And it just reminded me that here is a godly man who has made an option that I'm not comfortable with making for my children. But whatever he's doing, his kids are highly educated. They're very well educated, and they're very godly. And I would take his son in a heartbeat, his the spiritual leadership and things. So the point just being, give grace generously. So what we're talking about is just making wise choices about educating our children. Any further thoughts before we leave this one?
I would just say, before we leave this one, give grace even within whatever movement you're in. We have, especially because we know the homeschool movement, homeschoolers have incredibly strong opinions about how you should be homeschooling your children. And so give grace. If people are not doing exactly what you do, use the curriculum, do all the extracurricular activities that your children do.
That's really good.
Give grace.
Yes, thank you, sweetheart. Wise choices about educating our children. Well, this is Keeping It Young, and our time is gone. Thank you so much for listening today.
The Keeping It Young podcast is a Bax 5 Media production. All rights reserved.